to the Governance Podcast by the Centre for the Study of Governance and Society at King's College London. I'm Bryan Cheang. I'm the Assistant Director of this organisation. Today, we're very pleased to have with us Professor Daniel Smith. Daniel Smith is the Director of the Political Economy Research Institute and Professor of Economics in the Jones College of Business at Middle Tennessee State University. His academic research and policy work uses Austrian and public choice economics to analyze private and public governance institutions. Today, we'll be discussing with Daniel his new book, co-authored with Peter Boettke and Alexander Salter, with Cambridge University Press, titled Money and the Rule of Law: Generality and Predictability in Monetary Institutions. Daniel, thanks for joining us on an episode of our podcast.
Thank you, Brian. It's great to be with you. Thanks for the invitation.
Perhaps we can start off the discussion by asking you, why did you decide to write a book connecting monetary policy, monetary institutions with the rule of law? What is the problem that you see right now that you're trying to identify and put your finger on?
Yeah, so we're looking at the rule of law and its application across a wide range of government programs, and it's something that classical liberals appreciate and have a deep respect for. It's one of the things that drives economic growth and prosperity around the world. And we noticed that the rule of law did not get applied to central banking, which is a real puzzle because sound money is one of the most core components of economic freedom and one of the drivers of economic prosperity around the world. And the undermining of sound money has been at the catalyst for some of the worst and most catastrophic events in human history: the fall of the Roman Empire, the French Revolution, Hitler's rise to power, the Great Depression, the financial crisis. And it's just odd that we never applied the rule of law, especially because if you go back in the academic literature, there was a debate among academic economists about money and the rule of law, like should we have rules or discretion? And rules won that debate, hands down. But in practice, discretion won that debate. So essentially, we're looking at a central banking institutions around the world that are largely conducted by unelected and oftentimes unaccountable officials, essentially given complete discretion. So it's an epistocracy that does not have democratic justifiability in terms of being connected to the people and driven and conducted on their behalf. So rather than money being seen as a property right of citizens that needs to be protected and defended, it is oftentimes seen as a prerogative of central banks and all of the influences that they receive from major financial players and politicians.
So when we discuss applying the rule of law in the area of monetary policy, what do we mean by this? Some people may think of simply inflation targeting, right? Setting a certain rate for policymakers to aim at. But it seems that you are recommending something deeper than that. It's about institutional and constitutional arrangements, right? So what do we mean by applying the rule of law in this case?
Yeah, that's a great question. Now, certainly inflation targeting could be construed as one rule, but in practice, it's oftentimes been a very weak rule, either one that's informally followed, like at the Federal Reserve, where they're allowed to deviate it from it as they saw fit. And they're the ones that decided that they were the ones going to pursue that rule. And there's no punishment mechanism for deviating from that rule or bonuses for hitting it. So what we argue for is a true monetary rule, not a pseudo rule that isn't actually enforced, a true binding monetary rule that actually constrains what central bankers are allowed to do, no matter how heavy the political pressure or pressure they get from big financial institutions. They have a strict rule they have to adhere to, and they're given rewards for following it, and they're punished for deviating from that rule. And that creates generality and predictability in money, which is fundamental, especially during time of a crisis, for entrepreneurs out there making all the decisions, reallocating capital. To have general and predictable money is essential for economic growth and prosperity.
I'm just wondering, if we look at the world today, are there certain countries or case studies that you think would be worth emulating? Any maybe experiments with such rules that you think are worth copying?
Yeah, so we identify three different types of rules that we think fit under this criteria of creating generality and predictability in monetary institutions. We don't think the discussion is limited to those three. We just think those are the best three at this time, and we don't take a side on any of those. But those are: one, to create a strictly binding rule like end GDP targeting, which has received a lot of attention in the academic literature and we find very intriguing. Second, and this is from James Buchanan, is to constitutionalize money. So if money is a fundamental right of citizens, then put it in the Constitution right next to other rights like the freedom of speech. And that at least protects it, gives another layer of protection against from politicians and special interest groups. And the third would be free banking, which is the most radical idea. This was the one proposed by F.A. Hayek, would actually allow private banks to issue currency in competition with government, or just eliminate central banks altogether and allow money to become a privately provided commodity. But we find those as the three most interesting. We do a survey of other types of rules that have been implemented around the world, such as inflation targeting. And they've even been implemented with punishment mechanisms, like at the Bank of New Zealand or the European Union. There were some explicit punishment mechanisms. Thing is that they're rarely, if ever, used. And the other problem with inflation targeting rules is that whenever they didn't hit those targets, they changed the rules. They changed the range of the inflation target to suit the circumstances rather than stick to the rules when it was hard to do the right thing. So by and large, the rules that central bankers have adopted themselves and tried to enforce themselves have failed. We need a stricter binding rule that comes from a legislative authority that really curtails and constrains what central bankers are allowed to do.
Thank you. Before we delve deeper into some of these recommendations and prescriptions that you have suggested, I'd like to take a step back and focus a little bit more about the analysis that you conduct in the book itself. And I refer specifically to page 15. I think this is very interesting. You wrote in this page here that readers familiar with mainstream monetary economics and macroeconomics may find our methods and arguments unusual. We will not construct any mathematical models nor test econometrically any hypotheses. Instead, you'll be using simple verbal logic grounded in economic way of thinking, why we believe constrained discretion cannot be adopted by central banks if their goal is economic stability. So perhaps could you share with us why do you say that these methods are a bit unusual, and why do you think this move is justified, in your analysis in this book?
Well, I think there's two things that underline our decision to go that route and why we think that's the best case. One is it's really hard when you're dealing with issues of political philosophy to put it into the mainstream preferred methodology, which is technical models. Usually they smuggle in some political philosophy somehow as an assumption into those models, or it's underlying it. There's the implications of the model. Is there some political philosophy notion at play? But the political philosophy isn't brought to the forefront and actually articulated and thus critiqued and scrutinized as it should be. So what we're doing is we're taking all these underlying assumptions about the proper scope and size of government as it pertains to central banking and bring them out in the open. Say, let's have an honest debate about the political philosophy of central banking. The second is we're looking at underlying concern behind this entire project, and why I started upon it was Mark Pennington's book, Robust Political Economy. And in that book, he argues that we need to design institutions that are robust to knowledge and incentive problems. And we really wanted to take that project and apply it to central banking. So fundamentally, what we want to do is start from scratch and say, how do we design central banking institutions that are robust to real world knowledge and incentive problems?
And on page 16, you really focus on the importance of institutions. And I think this is a really important move that you make, because many times when we talk about policies or problems, people look on the surface and they don't delve into the fundamental institutional arrangements surrounding them, right? And you wrote here, our takeaway message is that if monetary economists and macroeconomists want to make lasting contributions to the quest for economic stability in a self-governing society, they must think constitutionally. Calibrating formal models and studying policy effects econometrically were valuable of secondary importance. fundamental institutional considerations come first. So I think on this note, do you think, what do you think this says about, mainstream economics, the kind of research that we do, and really the importance of looking back to the institutional underpinnings?
Yeah, that and what made us think of this is we actually were analyzing the progression of Milton Friedman's ideas on central banking over time. Initially, Milton Friedman was, gung-ho about we just have to get the right people, meaning academics in charge of central banks, and equip them with right technical models. And Hayek was actually like this beginning of his career as well. Let's refine our technical models. Let's get better empirical, better at gathering empirical data, and we can improve central banking. But both Nobel laureates, by the end of their careers, actually switched tunes. They became frustrated that they even when they got the right people in position. So even Milton Friedman, Arthur Burns, who he worked closely with, he wrote an op-ed praising it. Like, finally, we got a good academic scholar. Central banking is now going to be set on the right path. I think it's like only 8 months later, he wrote another op-ed saying it didn't matter. They're still doing the same shenanigans that they've been doing. They've violating the rule of law, not enacting sound policy. And it's that frustration that even when you get good academics, such as Ben Bernanke, who's arguably the best person to be at the helm of the Federal Reserve when a financial crisis is occurring, he's a scholar of the Great Depression. He's got good practitioner experience in central banking as a governor beforehand. He's who you want, the best and brightest from the economics profession, well-intentioned. And yet even he, when it came to the financial crisis, we argue, undermined the rule of law in money, and enacted policies that we think undermined sound money and made the economy worse off. So that's the frustration that we were struggling with. Is it's not about getting the right people in position. It's not about refining the data. That's important to a degree. Don't get us wrong. We're big fans of that. But on the margin, there's far more return for studying the underlying institutions that drive that behavior and provide the structure of incentives and the flow of information that these actors receive in their roles as central bankers.
And this brings us to the discussion of robust political economy analysis, right, which we at the Center for Study of Governance and Society care a lot about. And robust political economy really is about evaluating alternative institutions based on whether or not they cope with knowledge and incentive problems, right? So you spend a chapter each in a book discussing these. Perhaps we could go, one at a time and firstly talk about the incentive problems. And particularly, I'm curious whether or not this area of monetary policy is more susceptible to these problems than in other policy areas.
Yeah, I'd be happy to discuss that. So we break up the incentive problems at traditional central banks into two types of pressures. One is internal pressures, and the second is external pressures. So internal pressures, these are central banks, just like any other government bureaucracy, are bureaucracies, right? They have the same tendencies to maximize their budgets, self-preservation, inertia, and groupthink. Just an example of this, Ben Bernanke, when he was a governor, I believe it was in 2002, at Milton Friedman's 90th birthday, he did an institutional apology on behalf of the Federal Reserve saying, "You're right, Milton Friedman, we caused the Great Depression. Thanks to you, we won't do it again." So this was 70 years after the event occurred, after the profession had already been won over and realized that, yeah, the Federal Reserve caused the Great Depression and made it more severe and lengthened it. That's how long it took the Federal Reserve to actually admit that, which is pretty impressive. And then there's other examples that we provide of inertia, and examples of, when central banks are the primary employer of monetary economists around the world, that creates a huge perverse incentive for the profession to engage in groupthink. And there's even examples that we offer where central banks, such as the Federal Reserve, have cut people off from attending their conferences, or people have been pushed out, and examples of suppression of research that was critical of the Federal Reserve within the system. But that's not the most important pressure. The more important pressure that is exerted on central banks that we argue is the external pressures. And these, there's a couple: debt accommodation, political influence, and special interest groups. So debt accommodation, this is pretty straightforward. When a government issues a lot of debt, it's necessarily going to have an impact on underlying market conditions. It's going to affect interest rates. So if a central bank simply just even if they don't want to accommodate that debt, if they just want to keep markets even keel, they have to adjust their policy and necessarily support that debt regardless. And we saw examples of this under the Federal Reserve when they switched to a new operating system. And I don't want to get too technical, but they switched from a corridor operating system to a floor operating system. And when Trump initiated some fiscal policies, the Federal Reserve measurably had to adjust its policies in order to just keep things constant. But certainly other policies currently under discussion, such as individual accounts at the Federal Reserve or other central banks to allow direct stimulus, would create more pressures on this in this regard, and certainly modern monetary theory would create more pressures in this regard. The other pressures, political influence, this includes pressure from the executive branch and legislative branch. The executive branch has the power of appointment, and the legislative branch, the Senate, at least in the United States, has the appointment to approve those appointments. But there's also pressure beyond that. There's the testimonies, there's the quid pro quo going, okay, we will pursue this economic policy if you don't do this. There's been close relationships we identified, like between Alan Greenspan and Bill Clinton. President Trump getting on Twitter is another example. More modernly, exerting pressure on the central banks to get interest rates down. Richard Nixon in his recorded tapes with Arthur Burns, he's laughing in the White House in the Oval Office saying, yeah, the Federal Reserve is independent, but really just get those interest rates down or else there'll be ramifications. And then the final one is special interest groups. These are major financial institutions like Goldman Sachs that have undue influence on monetary decision making. And this is due to two factors. One is the revolving door between these major financial institutions and the Treasury and the Federal Reserve. So it's people that are buddies and friends with each other, rotating back and forth between those positions. The second is more practical. It's that when a crisis situation occurs, getting real-time information because of all the uncertainty is really hard. So central bankers rely on the key players. They call them up frequently and say, hey, what's going on? But that introduces an avenue of potential bias that allows these major financial institutions to exaggerate the problem and therefore justify policy that would be more conducive to advancing their own interest.
And this discussion of incentive problem is interesting because the focus is on the incentive structure of the institutional environment. It is not about how well-intentioned, in a sense, the monetary policy maker is, right? Which means that we can put in place the most well-intentioned individual, yet these institutional constraints will still influence the individual's behavior, right? Is that the point you're making?
Yes, and in fact, in some research independently with Alex Salter that we briefly mentioned in this book, we go through Ben Bernanke, Alan Greenspan's, and Arthur Burns' writings before being at the Federal Reserve and after being at the Federal Reserve. We find a noticeable shift in the policies that they advocate for. So simply switching between the institution of the academy to moving to being a policymaker in a role at a central bank caused an institutional shift in their incentives that caused them to advocate for different policies.
So once again, institutions are of fundamental importance in influencing behavior of people in different environments. And perhaps now we can move on to the knowledge problem. What is this? And do you think perhaps this is more or less severe than the incentive problem in monetary policy?
So I'll actually start with that second part of that question. We viewed the knowledge problem as enabling the incentive problem. Right. So if there's genuine uncertainty about what you should be doing in the economy as a monetary authority, then that opens the door to be pressured by special interest groups or politicians because you honestly don't know what the right thing to do is. And we do make the case that monetary authorities do suffer from severe knowledge problems. We separate these into two things. One is technical problems. Technical problems make central banking inherently difficult, but not impossible. And then we also argue there are severe knowledge problems that actually make central banking means-end inconsistent. that you cannot actually achieve the ends of central banking due to these severe knowledge problems. So I'll start with the technical problems. These involve the setting of objectives, targets, instruments, and calibrating models. So the objectives of monetary policy, we typically assume that they're set in stone. It's maximizing employment subject to long-term price stability. But the thing is there's a lot more gray area in there. The short-term trade-offs, what's the weight that you give to each of these? We have actually statements from Bernanke and Yellen that we go over where they actually place different weights at different times to these objectives. And we think there's actually a reason, that central bankers actually prefer to keep these unspecified because that gives them more discretion. And it also allows them to introduce unofficial arguments into the equation, such as Fed funds rate smoothing, financial stability, exchange rate stabilization, affordability of housing, even climate change and inequality have recently entered central banking discourse as potential goals that they should pursue or at least account for in setting policy. Targets. So traditionally central banks look at the short-term the overnight lending rate. In America, the Fed's fund rate, the term structure of interest, inflation, it could be NGDP targeting. So there's a wide range of targets that they could focus on, and even calculating these, such as like average inflation targeting. Well, how long are you taking the average? How quickly will you get back to the average if there's a deviation? So there's a lot of gray area there. And also recently, at least for the Federal Reserve, it transitioned from its primary target being the federal funds rate to interest on excess reserves, with very little discussion about that. So once again, it makes it really difficult when you actually don't know what the target is, or the target could potentially be moving over time. The instruments themselves, so these are the tools that the central bank actually uses to implement monetary policy. Traditionally, it's been buying and selling treasuries, the required reserve ratio, and a penalty rate for when banks are forced to borrow from them when they can't get that overnight lending to meet the reserve requirements for private institutions. But now central banks in the financial crisis, and especially now in COVID-19, have resorted to some unconventional monetary policy instruments such as interest on excess reserves, direct lending, large-scale asset purchases, maturity extensions. So we've seen a wide range of different types of instruments employed, and there's oftentimes with little consideration. A lot of the tools employed during COVID-19 were not employed even in the financial crisis. And so we don't have a real good understanding of what the implications are, how they operate, where, what their sweet spot is, or how they interact with other instruments that we have. And then the final technical problem is calibrating the model itself. So after a central bank intervenes, let's put the dipstick into the economy and see how it's doing to judge how well we have done. Well, there's a wide range of metrics for trying to measure the economy. Central banks have used interest rates, labor market, housing market. Ben Bernanke said that he even used men's underwear sales and gold at times to try to measure the state of the economy. And even something like the labor market, there's a lot of different metrics: unemployment, the labor force participation, hiring rights, job opening rates. So there's a lot of different metrics that could potentially be used to calibrate models. Lots of different ways to even measure GDP. In fact, in the United States, there's two different central banks issue conflicting GDP estimates. But that's not the true knowledge problem. Those are just the technical difficulties that make conducting monetary policy extremely difficult. What we argue that makes central banking impossible is the same arguments that make central planning of the economy impossible. And that is that as a fiat supplier of currency, they have to adjust the supply of currency in response to changes in the demand for currency. And in a monopoly system, there is no feedback automatic adjustment mechanism like there would be in the market to automatically give central bankers the knowledge of what the demand for money is and how it's changing, and then the incentives for them to actually address it. So basically, just to kind of restate that, I think in a clearer fashion, economists can come up with long-term estimates of what the demand for money is, but we commission central bankers specifically to mitigate short-run and medium-run fluctuations. That's the whole justification for discretionary central banking. And it's in the short and medium run that the demand for money can change in ways that we can't predict, especially during a crisis situation. And new technologies such as NFTs and cryptocurrency, new ways that the demand for money can manifest itself, can fundamentally affect that demand for money. Demographics, fiscal policy, regulatory policy, a whole range of different metrics can influence that demand for money in very unpredictable ways. And we argued that's the true knowledge problem that that a central bank supplier faces. And so they will always be oversupplying or undersupplying the currency, and thus thereby creating monetary disequilibrium, and therefore undermining the validity and power of the price system in a free enterprise system to encourage entrepreneurship and innovation and the servicing consumers.
And thinking further about the knowledge problem that we just discussed, do you think that in this specific area of monetary policy, there may be a certain sense of asymmetric information, given the very technical and complex nature of this policy area, as compared to healthcare policy or fiscal policy? It's just something that ordinary citizens and even perhaps elected officials have a problem fully understanding. Could this perhaps give certain room for monetary policy makers specifically to engage in some level of unaccountability?
Yeah, that's the primary justification for having essentially the epistocracy or high priest of central banking that we currently have. That ordinary citizens don't understand this. Even many politicians don't understand this. And even if they did, they wouldn't have the right incentives. So therefore, we need to give these experts a lot of discretion and leeway in order to tailor monetary policy to the circumstances, and thus do it in a way that would exceed what would happen if we did it more democratically. We reject this. Our rule by experts has fundamentally failed. When we look at the historical literature comparing the Federal Reserve to institutions before that, it's very clear the Federal Reserve has not improved macroeconomic stability. It's still led to the Great Depression, the financial crisis, and not just allowed those to happen. We fundamentally argue with the literature that central banking actually was the catalyst that caused and prolonged both of those catastrophic events. So rather than try to entrust unelected and unaccountable experts to have discretion, we argue for creating those binding rules on monetary policy authorities so that we have generality and predictability in money. That's far superior to allowing this discretion that so often has been used inappropriately throughout history.
What then would you say to the argument that sometimes, we need a level of discretion, especially when it comes to emergency situations? We need policymakers to have this flexibility to engage in discretionary actions, including in monetary policy? Or do you think there is totally no scope for discretion? Perhaps, it's a certain continuum. Where do you draw the line here?
Yeah, so that's we tackled that direct on in one of our chapters. We think that particularly during a time of crisis is precisely when you need rules the most. It's because during a time of crisis is when the knowledge problems are going to be the most severe. You have the fog of war, so to speak, and monetary experts, just like the regular citizen, don't know what's going on. A good example of this is COVID-19 right now. There's all sorts of supply constraints going on, and it's really hard for these monetary authorities are really struggling with, should we engage in easy or loose monetary policy right now? It's hard, and we argue unknowable. And then, of course, incentive problems are also the most severe during crisis situations, because especially politicians want to use the crisis opportunity to advance agendas that they have, and to increase the scope and size of government. You also have special interest groups that are clamoring for bailouts and policy that's going to in particular benefit them. So at the time of a crisis is when a rule-bound central bank would actually provide the most benefits and the most predictability. You need entrepreneurs in the economy to be able to predict to reliably predict there's going to be sound money so they can reallocate capital to help adjust the economy out of that recession, rather than adding monetary uncertainty on top of all the other uncertainty that entrepreneurs face in trying to get out of a recession.
Speaking about the use of discretion during emergency situations, let's perhaps think a little bit about COVID-19 and how that may have really affected monetary policy and the increased use of discretion. My understanding is that since last year, short-term interest rates, which were already very low in most advanced economies, were quickly cut around the world, reaching around zero in all advanced economies and even in some emerging market economies. How do you see, COVID-19 is having an impact on monetary policy? And do you think that, it's different, in terms of impacts compared to, the Great Recession of 2008?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So when we look at what happened with COVID-19 and the policies implemented by central banks around the world, one of the most noticeable things is after the financial crisis, a lot of central banks like the Federal Reserve never unwound their balance sheets. So they didn't have a lot of dry powder, so to speak, to actually engage traditional tools. Interest rates were really low. They had large asset balances on their portfolios. There wasn't much they could do in terms of traditional tools. And there were, of course, several advocates prior to that saying, hey, every 10, 15 years, we can expect a recession. Nobody could have predicted a global pandemic, certainly. But we know, every once in a while, there are recessions, and we should have been more prepared by creating a lean and mean central bank that didn't have such a large impact on the economy during a regular normal time, because that enabled the central bank to engage its traditional tools more effectively when a true recession occurred. But after that, pretty immediately, central banks engaged all their traditional tools to the max. And then they started to resort to some of the unconventional policies resorted to during the financial crisis, and even invented new programs. And some of these programs, I think, are deep concern for those who care about a classical liberal society and robust political economy. For instance, in the United States, the Federal Reserve implemented programs that bailed out state and local governments, creating a potential moral hazard problem, very similar to the moral hazard problem that the European Union faced with Portugal, Italy, Spain, in terms of if you have a monetary union but individual fiscal sovereignty, that provides the incentives for local level governments to engage in reckless fiscal policies and expect to be bailed out. And that's exactly what this type of system enables. There's also interventions in, the Federal Reserve directly intervened in the bond market, which is unprecedented. There's no bank-run problem in the bond market, so there's no theoretical justification for a central bank actually bailing out the bond market. So that was pretty extraordinary, and it also opened the door to politicians being able to say, "Hey, if we're going to intervene in the bond market and help out these corporations, can't we can't we implement a $15 minimum wage? Can't we implement environmental policies?" Those may be important objectives, but they should run through the proper legislative channels, not through the back door by the Federal Reserve owning bonds and controlling and bailing out bonds, and thus mandating those through the back door. Other policies I think that are kind of notable are the direct lending to Main Street businesses. So traditionally, central banks around the world have refused, and this goes back to Walter Bagehot, right? We're supposed to provide general liquidity, never actually pick winners and losers, who's getting the money. And that's exactly what the Federal Reserve did, is they stepped into the economy and said, okay, we're going to identify certain businesses and give loans to them, rather than just providing general liquidity to the market and allowing the banks to make that using private criteria. So I think, and that's just a couple of the programs. I think there's a wide range of other programs as well that create potential fissures in the economy if they become conventional tools that the central bank employs every time there is a crisis. And we have no reason to suspect they won't. Several of the tools used in the financial crisis that were just one-time things were brought back during COVID-19.
Perhaps we can now discuss, on the solutions that you've recommended in the book, particularly the constitutional solution inspired by the work of James Buchanan, as well as free banking. Let's start with the first, and let's think about, how has the ideas of Buchanan influenced your work here, and how feasible do you think this approach is?
Yeah, so Buchanan started, James Buchanan, who I was actually undergrad at Middle Tennessee State University and then was a professor of mine at George Mason. Um, he started the field of public choice, which first, examined the incentive problems in government. And part of his research also looked at monetary institutions. But the second field that he created was constitutional political economy as a solution to that first problem. Let's find ways to craft rules to govern our rule makers to prevent them from engaging in discretionary activity that is not general and that is discriminatory. So he wanted to create a constitution that creates general and non-discriminatory rules. So we apply that concept as he did to monetary institutions in arguing that one way to ensure generality and predictability in money and to move it out of the hands of politicians and special interest groups is to actually create a constitutional rule that provides protections, constitutional protections to sound money. There are problems with that, and that is that politicians can ignore constitutional provisions as they have done occasionally in the past, and they can also change the Constitution, but at least creates a barrier that makes it much harder to do that. The more interesting idea, at least for myself, I won't speak for my co-authors, is the idea of free banking. And this was advanced by F.A. Hayek later on in his career. And it's the simple observation that in world history and even around the world today, there are some societies that allow private banks to issue currency in competition with one another. And what's really interesting about allowing the market to provide currency is you don't have the knowledge and incentive problems. And that is because if a bank is issuing currency and it's backed by gold or silver, and they inflate that currency, so they issue too much, well, if you're holding that currency, you're realizing, hey, this is worth less now. I'm going to take it back and redeem it for the gold and silver, and then go grab a different currency to exchange with. So the bank automatically starts losing gold and silver reserves and realizes, we've made a mistake. We can no longer float our currency, and they're going to be forced to bring back their currency levels down to the optimal in accordance with monetary demand. So they have both the knowledge and the incentives to actually provide the optimal amount of currency. And you don't have to read the tea leaves with monetary experts, just leave it up to the market to do that. It sounds crazy and radical, but there are legitimate scholars in this area studying this. And we consider one of the more viable ideas that we advance for creating generality and predictability in money.
How do you think the rise of cryptocurrency fits into this solution of free banking that you just advocated? And I'm just also curious about where you stand on the debate between advocates of hard commodity money like gold and silver, and on the other hand, cryptocurrency.
Mm. Yeah, so I'm fascinated by cryptocurrency. So I'm glad you asked. I'm a big fan of everything going on, and I love that there's competition out there. I do think that governments, by threatening legislation, are hampering some developments in cryptocurrency and its extension and its ability to become more of a commonly used medium of exchange. At least in the United States, the Federal Reserve and other government agencies are trying to find ways to regulate cryptocurrency in certain capacities that I think would undermine its potential. I also think legal tender laws prohibit cryptocurrency from being fully what it should be. And what I mean by legal tender laws is when governments have a centralized monopoly supplier of currency, they make it illegal for anyone else to create a competing private currency. So if we just remove those laws and allowed competition to emerge, whether it be in the banking sector, banks issuing their own private currency, or in the crypto sector, I'm a big fan of just letting the market decide. I don't know which one, to get to your other question, which one is going to be superior, privately issued money backed by gold and silver, or cryptocurrency, or maybe even privately issued currency backed by cryptocurrency. All sorts of innovations could be unleashed if we would simply allow entrepreneurs to work on solving that problem and creating a medium of exchange that people saw value in, rather than hampering those efforts simply so the government can control the commanding heights of the economy through central banks.
And lastly, to end off our discussion, I'd like to ask you a final question. Looking at current events today, and the way that monetary policy has evolved recently, are you more optimistic or pessimistic about how, this is going to turn out in the near future? So are you at the end an optimist or a pessimist? And also, what would be your final takeaway message to our listeners today?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. It seems to be on the day. Some days I wake up very optimist. Some days I wake up a pessimist. It's really hard for me to see how going forward we can make radical changes to central banks around the world. They're entrenched bureaucracies. A special interest group that benefits from the system. They have a lot of prestige and influence. So it's really hard to see how especially some of the more radical solutions such as free banking would ever be implemented. However, we did write the book, right? We took the time to write the book because we think, if you could make the case that we could convince people that this is a really important area and that we should think creatively about finding institutional solutions to creating better monetary institutions, even if they aren't the ones that we kind of rest our hat on. I'm long term, I'm optimistic, I think, and that I think we can convince people, and that it's becoming increasingly obvious that central banks are deviating from their original mission and taking on all sorts of additional responsibilities. And I think the most noticeable that is catching on is climate change and inequality. People are like raising their eyebrows, like, even if those are important issues, and I think they are, they shouldn't be done by a central bank. So to the extent that happens, I think we can make a case to constrain the Federal Reserve. I'm real big on the possibility of end GDP targeting as a rule that central banks should follow. And I think that would obviate the need for having such a large bureaucracy, because if you're following a standard rule that's very simple to follow, well, you don't need hundreds upon hundreds of staff economists to be trying to predict which way the economy is going. So you can kind of unwind the Federal Reserve without actually bringing in the radical idea of free banking yet, and get people used to the idea of a much smaller central banking footprint on the economy.
Thank you very much, Professor Daniel Smith. Money and the Rule of Law, published by Cambridge University Press.
Thank you, Brian. It's a pleasure to be with you.